Hello students, welcome back to your English literature class. In your previous session, we had done the reading of pages 118 till 121 of the lesson Be Wordsworth by V.S. Naipaul. Today, we shall continue the same. By the end of this video, you will be able to understand the meanings of difficult words as used in the context, express the story in your own words, and quote lines from the text to substantiate your answers. Till now, you have read that about a week after their first meeting, the narrator, while returning from school, met B. Wordsworth again at the corner of Meagle Street. Wordsworth invited him to his house to eat mangoes from his yard. They soon became close friends. When the narrator reached home, his mother thrashed him, and he angrily went back to Wordsworth's house. B. Wordsworth and the narrator went out for a walk. They lay on the grass and watched the sky and the stars. One day, when the narrator was in Wordsworth's house, he was told a story about a boy poet and a girl poet who were married to each other. They continued going for long walks together. They spent quality time with each other, had ice cream, and even shared their secrets. Now let us continue with today's reading. Open your Echoes textbook at page number 121. Let's read. One day, when I was in his yard, he said to me, "I have a great secret, which I am now going to tell you." I said, "It really secret?" At the moment, yes. I looked at him and he looked at me. He said, "This is just between you and me. Remember? I am writing a poem." Oh, I was disappointed. He said, "But this is a different sort of poem. This is the greatest poem in the world." I whistled. On an occasion, some days later, while inside a yard, Wordsworth told the narrator that he had a great secret that he wanted to tell him. The narrator appeared somewhat bewildered. Wordsworth said that he was writing a poem that would be the world's greatest poem. The narrator had expected something startling, something new and shocking, but the mention of the poem left him disappointed. Wordsworth said that it was not just any poem. It was going to be the greatest poem in the world, which created excitement in the narrator, and he whistled. He said, "I have been working on it for more than 5 years now. I will finish it in about 22 years from now. That is, if I keep on writing at the present rate." "You does write a lot then," he said. "Not any more. I just write 1 line a month. But I make sure it is a good line." I asked, "What was last month's good line?" He looked up at the sky and said, "The past is deep." I said, "It is a beautiful line." So Wordsworth told the narrator that he had been working on this poem for 5 years, and it might take him another 22 years to finish it. The narrator found it quite puzzling. Wordsworth added to his wonder by saying that he wrote just 1 line a month. With a curious look, the narrator asked what was the last month's line. Wordsworth said, "The past is deep." And the narrator appreciated B. Wordsworth's line. He stood there wonderstruck. B. Wordsworth said, "I hope to distill the experiences of a whole month into that single line of poetry. So, in 22 years, I shall have written a poem that will sing to all humanity. I was filled with wonder. Distill means extract the essential meaning of. So, Wordsworth told the narrator that he wrote only one line in 1 month because he wanted to extract the essential meaning of the whole month's experiences into that one single line. And in 22 years, he will have completed the poem that will sing to all humanity. The narrator stood there in wonder. Our walks continued. We walked down the seawall at Dockside one day, and I said, "Mr. Wordsworth, if I drop this pin in the water, you think it will float?" He said, "This is a strange world. Drop your pin and let us see what will happen." The pin sank. Seawall. A wall or embankment erected to prevent the sea encroaching on an area of land. So their walks continued, and one day they were walking along the seawall at Dockside. Now, the narrator wanted to ask, if he dropped a pin into the water, would it float or would it sink? Wordsworth let him drop the pin in order to find it out. The two tried the experiment. The pin sank. So children, here we can say that he taught the boy to explore. I said, "How is the poem this month?" But he never told me any other line. He merely said, "Oh, it comes, you know, it comes." So when narrator asked him about the poem, Wordsworth didn't tell him anything about it. He only said it comes. So he never told him anything more about the poem. Or we would sit on the seawall and watch the liners come into the harbor. But of the greatest poem in the world, I heard no more. I felt he was growing older. A liner is a large, luxurious passenger ship. So they would sit on the seawall and they would see large ships coming to the harbor. But Wordsworth never talked about the greatest poem in the world. The narrator could realize that now Wordsworth was growing older. "How you does live, Mr. Wordsworth?" I asked him one day. He said, "You mean how I get money?" When I nodded, he laughed in a crooked way. A crooked way means in a dishonest manner. He said, "I sing calypsos in the calypso season." Calypsos, these are Caribbean songs on contemporary issues, or you can say a West Indian type of singing. And that lasts you the rest of the year? It is enough. But you will be the richest man in the world when you write the greatest poem. He didn't reply. Once the narrator asked the poet how he made his both ends meet. Wordsworth didn't have a straight answer. In a dishonest way, he told him that he sang calypsos in calypso season, and he earned enough to last him for a year. Reassuringly, the narrator told him that after his poetry saw the light of the day, he would be the richest man on the earth. But Wordsworth didn't reply. One day, when I went to see him in his little house, I found him lying on his little bed. He looked so old and so weak that I found myself wanting to cry. He said, "The poem is not going well." He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through the window at the coconut tree, and he was speaking as though I wasn't there. He said, "When I was 20, I felt the power within myself. Then, almost in front of my eyes, I could see his face growing older and more tired." He said, "But that was a long time ago." One day the narrator went to see the poet in his shack, or you can say his hut. He was shocked to see the poet lying helplessly on his bed. The zest, the enthusiasm, and the optimism seemed to have left him forever. He was looking away through the window towards the coconut tree. Quite magically, his face became wrinkled in a very short period of time. He seemed to be clutching to the last strand of his life helplessly. B. Wordsworth told the narrator that his poem was not going well. Then he narrated to him that when he was young, he felt quite energetic, but now, as he is growing old, he doesn't feel the same power. And then I felt so keenly, it was as though I had been slapped by my mother. I could see it clearly on his face. It was there for everyone to see. Death on his shrinking face. Keenly means intensely. Shrinking means becoming smaller in size. So the narrator could realize that B. Wordsworth was not fine. He felt such a pain as he felt when his mother slapped him. He could clearly see death written on the face of B. Wordsworth. He looked at me and saw my tears and sat up. He said, "Come." I went and sat on his knees. He looked into my eyes and he said, "Oh, you can see it too. I always knew you had the poet's eye." He didn't even look sad, and that made me burst crying loudly. He pulled me to his thin chest and said, "Do you want me to tell you a funny story?" He smiled encouragingly at me, but I couldn't reply. When the narrator saw B. Wordsworth in such a bad condition, he started crying. At that time, B. Wordsworth called the narrator to him. The narrator sat on his knees. Rather stoically, Wordsworth said that he could see the grief in the narrator's face because he was a poet. He pulled the narrator to his chest and offered to tell him a very funny story. He said, "When I have finished this story, I want you to promise that you will go away and never come back to see me. Do you promise?" I nodded. B. Wordsworth pulled the narrator to his chest and offered to tell him a very funny story, but he made him swear that he would never come again there after he heard out the story. The narrator agreed. He said, "Good. Well, listen. That story I told you about the boy poet and the girl poet, do you remember that? That wasn't true. It was something I just made up. All this talk about poetry and the greatest poem in the world, that wasn't true either. Isn't that the funniest thing that you have heard?" And his voice broke. So Wordsworth disclosed that the story about a boy and a girl in love that he had told him earlier was just a fiction. It was not reality. And all the talks about poetry and the world's greatest poem, they were also lies. And while speaking this, his voice faltered. Perhaps he was overwhelmed with emotion. Now, children, why do you think B. Wordsworth told the narrator that whatever he had told him about the poem and the boy poet and the girl poet was a lie? See, children, B. Wordsworth wanted to protect the little boy from the harsh realities of life. He could see the latent talent within the boy to be a poet. He saw his early life in the little boy, the reflection of a poet in making who would have to invariably face the same trials and rejections as a poet, hurt B. Wordsworth to no end. He wanted to save the little boy from the misery and tragedy of the real life, where there are no buyers and appreciators of a poet's words. Thus, to save the boy from the fate that he met in his life as a poet, he negates his own story at the end, making a mockery out of his own existence. I left the house and ran home crying, like a poet, for everything I saw. I walked along Alberto Street a year later, but I could find no sign of the poet's house. It hadn't vanished just like that. It had been pulled down, and a big two-storied building had taken its place. The mango tree, the plum tree, and the coconut tree had all been cut down, and there was brick and concrete everywhere. It was just as though B. Wordsworth had never existed. So, after listening to B. Wordsworth's revelation, the narrator started crying and he ran away to his house. After a year, when the narrator passed through Alberto Street, he found only concrete blocks standing where Wordsworth's house stood. The mango tree, the plum tree, and the coconut tree had been felled. There was no trace of any greenery. It was concrete everywhere, and it appeared as if B. Wordsworth had never existed. Children, this last line of the story elucidates the fact that B. Wordsworth was never the greatest poet in the world. He failed to make an impression on the minds of the readers, and therefore he lived a life of oblivion. Oblivion means unknown. Unfortunately for B. Wordsworth, he could never make a mark as a poet, enough to be remembered by the world after he was gone. Therefore, his house being pulled down had no significance, as he was just another human being, dead and forgotten, with no trace of existence in this world. This brings us to the end of today's lesson. I hope you have understood the story. For your homework, children, solve question 1b on your Echoes workbook. Do you think that the story of the boy poet and the girl poet, which B. Wordsworth told the narrator, was his own story? Give reasons to support your answer. Thank you.